Have you ever felt like you were caught in something much bigger than you could understand? Something that you didn't choose, but found yourself trapped in anyway? This is the story of two officers who thought they knew what danger looked like. But what they didn't expect was a truth so dark, so terrifying, that it shattered everything they believed. They crossed a line, and now, they can't escape the consequences. What happens next? Will they survive the nightmare they've unleashed, or will the darkness claim them forever? Stay with us until the end to uncover the shocking truth behind their fate. And if you're ready for more heart-pounding, spine-tingling stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me, this journey is just beginning. Subscribe now and join us on this unforgettable ride. The sun had just begun to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the empty street. A quiet breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the sidewalk. The city, usually alive with noise, felt eerily still that evening. Two officers, Officer Harris and Officer Daniels, stood near the corner, scanning the area. Their eyes caught a man walking down the street, a figure they hadn't noticed before. He was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a plain black jacket that looked out of place in the neighborhood. Harris nudged Daniels, a grin spreading across his face. "Let's have some fun," Harris muttered, his voice laced with a hint of arrogance. They moved toward the man, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. The man didn't flinch, didn't even glance their way as they approached. "Hey, you," Harris called, his tone sharp, demanding. The man slowed his pace but didn't turn. Daniels, sensing an opportunity for a little excitement, stepped forward. "Turn around," Daniels barked.
"Now."
The man stopped, slowly, deliberately, and finally faced them. His eyes were dark, piercing. There was no fear in his gaze, only calm. The officers, taken aback by his composure, exchanged a brief glance. "You don't belong here," Harris said, trying to sound commanding. The man remained silent, his posture relaxed. For a moment, the tension hung thick in the air, like something waiting to snap. Then, without warning, the man moved. He didn't run. He didn't struggle. He simply stepped forward, closer to Harris. The movement was so fast, so precise, that Harris barely had time to react. Before he could raise his hand, the man had him pinned against the wall, his arm locked around Harris's throat. Daniels froze, his hand hovering near his weapon but unsure. The grip tightened slightly, just enough to send a jolt of panic through Harris's chest. "I am not the one you want." The man's voice was calm, almost eerily so. Harris's breath became shallow, the pressure around his throat making his vision blur. Daniels finally snapped out of his daze, rushing forward to pull the man off. But before he could reach them, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Enough," the voice commanded. A third figure appeared from the shadows, a tall, imposing presence that neither officer had noticed before. The man released his hold on Harris, stepping back with a slow, deliberate motion. The third figure, dressed in all black, nodded at the man. "Let them go," the third figure said, his voice deep and authoritative. Without a word, the man nodded and stepped aside. Harris, gasping for air, stumbled back, his legs shaking. Daniels stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his holster. The third figure turned toward them, his gaze cold and unwavering. "You should have known better than to pick on the wrong person," he said, his voice low and filled with warning. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had underestimated the situation, made a snap decision based on pride and arrogance. And now they would pay the price. The man in the black jacket took one last look at the officers before turning away, disappearing into the shadows from which he had come. The third figure followed, vanishing just as quickly. The street fell silent again. But this time, it felt heavier, as if the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The officers stood there, frozen, processing what had just unfolded. They had learned their lesson the hard way. The street remained eerily silent, save for the distant hum of the city that seemed worlds away. The shadows of the trees swayed in the dim light, their movement almost mocking the two officers standing in stunned silence. The weight of the encounter settled heavily on their shoulders. Officer Harris's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his uniform, trying to regain some semblance of control. The air felt thicker now, the oppressive silence suffocating him. He coughed, his throat still tight from the hold the man had on him moments ago. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, each beat like a drum in his ears. Daniels, ever the more composed of the two, stood rigidly next to Harris, his eyes scanning the empty street, searching for something, anything, that might explain what had just happened. His breath was shallow, his mind racing as if he had just woken from a nightmare, struggling to piece together reality. Harris wiped his mouth, tasting the lingering bitterness of fear. He had been so certain, so damn certain that they had been in control, that they had the power, the authority. But everything had shifted so quickly. In the blink of an eye, it was as if they had stepped into a different world, one where their badges meant nothing. "You saw that, right?" Harris finally spoke, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. Daniels didn't reply at first. His gaze was fixed on the street ahead, 1,000 thoughts running through his mind. The man, that calm, unwavering man, and the shadowy figure who appeared out of nowhere, something about them didn't sit right. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. What was that? Daniels muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Harris. Harris didn't know how to answer. His mouth felt dry, his mind clouded with confusion. He had been humiliated, caught in a moment of weakness, and now, it seemed like he could never get the taste of fear out of his mouth. He wanted to believe it was just a strange encounter, a one-off situation, but deep down he knew it wasn't. Something had happened here that neither of them fully understood. "Maybe we should head back," Daniels suggested, his voice low. "We've made a mistake." Harris nodded slowly. He felt the sharp sting of embarrassment in his chest, but something deeper, more unsettling, lingered there too. It was like the very ground beneath his feet had shifted, and he was no longer certain of anything. They walked back toward their squad car, the sound of their footsteps echoing down the empty street, amplified by the eerie silence surrounding them. As they passed the alleyway where the man had disappeared, Harris couldn't help but glance down it, as if expecting to see something. But there was nothing, just the same darkened alley. The tension in the air was thick. Harris felt a knot form in his stomach, a feeling of dread crawling up his spine. The fear hadn't gone away. It had only intensified, growing stronger with each passing second. Do you think we're in trouble?" Harris asked, his voice barely audible. Daniels hesitated, glancing over at him. "I don't know, but something doesn't feel right about all this." They reached the car, and Daniels fumbled with the keys. He was trying to steady his hands, but they were shaking uncontrollably. They both got inside, the car's engine starting with a low hum. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating, as if neither of them knew what to say. Daniels put the car in gear and started driving. The city lights flickered outside the window, casting a soft glow on the empty streets. But the world outside felt distant now. It felt as though they had been cast adrift in a sea of confusion, with no anchor to hold them in place. Harris looked out of the window, his mind swirling with the events of the past few minutes. His hands still shook. His body was still on edge. Every little noise, every movement in the corner of his eye made his heart race. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" Harris finally asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Daniels didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, but his mind was far away, lost in thought. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice grim. "But I don't think that's the real question here." Harris turned to him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Daniels looked at him then, his expression darker than Harris had ever seen it. "We've just learned something. Something that's going to change everything." "What are you talking about?" Harris felt a chill run down his spine. Daniels' eyes flickered toward him for a brief moment, and for the first time, Harris saw something that resembled fear in his partner's eyes. "We've messed with the wrong people, Harris," Daniels said, his voice quiet but firm. "Those guys, they're not who they seem to be." They're not just some random person off the street. Harris felt his stomach tighten. Then who are they? Who the hell was that man? I don't know, Daniels muttered, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. But we've made a mistake. A big one. And now, I don't think we can just walk away from this. The car sped down the street, the city blurring past them. But Harris's mind wasn't on the road. It was on the man in the black jacket, the strange figure in the shadows, and the unsettling realization that they had been in the presence of something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. A long silence followed, stretching between them like an unspoken truth. Neither man knew what would happen next, but they both knew one thing for certain. They had just stepped into something much larger than themselves. And there was no going back. The world outside seemed to grow darker, as if the very atmosphere had changed. Harris's heart was pounding in his chest, and he could feel the weight of his breath, heavy and uneven. The car continued down the road, but the fear, the uncertainty, lingered. And as they turned the corner, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the shadows. Someone or something was following them. The car's tires hummed against the asphalt, the rhythmic sound barely reaching Harris's ears as he sat frozen, his eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the darkness that seemed to stretch beyond it. The air in the car was stifling, thick with tension. His breath felt shallow, and his chest tight, as if something heavy was pressing against him. "Did you hear that?" Harris's voice was barely a whisper, strained, as if he were speaking from a place far away, detached from the present moment. Daniels didn't answer at first. His gaze was focused ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. But Harris could see the flicker of uncertainty in his partner's eyes. His lips were set in a thin line, his jaw clenched tight. "I didn't hear anything," Daniels finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was lying, and Harris knew it. Daniels had heard it too, the faint sound of footsteps, quick and deliberate, as if someone was pacing just behind them. Harris's stomach twisted into a knot. He looked back at the rearview mirror again, his eyes scanning the empty street. There was nothing, just the dark stretch of road, illuminated by the dim glow of the headlights. But that silence, it was suffocating, like a heavy fog that had rolled in, blanketing the city. And the more Harris tried to ignore it, the more it consumed him. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. "It's just our imaginations playing tricks on us," Daniel said, more to himself than to Harris. But his words did little to calm the growing sense of dread that clung to the air. Harris's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Deep down, he could feel it in his bones. The kind of wrong that twisted the air in your lungs and made your heart race for reasons you couldn't explain. He tried to force his gaze forward, focusing on the road ahead, but the shadows were moving too quickly, slipping just beyond the corners of his vision. It was as if they were being followed, not just by anyone but by something or someone far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. "Maybe we should turn around," Harris suggested, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Daniels hesitated, glancing in the rearview mirror. His breath came in shallow bursts, his face pale under the dim streetlights. The footsteps, they were getting closer. "Too late," Daniels muttered under his breath, his voice tight with fear. Harris's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a warning. He didn't need to ask what Daniels meant. The air around them had shifted. It was no longer just an eerie feeling, it was real. Someone was there right behind them. Suddenly, the world outside the car felt too big, too overwhelming. The streetlights flickered as if they were on the edge of losing their strength, leaving only shadows in their wake. Harris tried to calm himself, to find some rational explanation for what was happening, but nothing made sense. He was too aware of the silence, the weight of their breaths, the unspoken words between them. "I think we're being followed," Harris whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet car. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, each syllable soaked with dread. Daniels didn't reply immediately. He was staring at the rearview mirror now, his eyes wide with realization. Harris could see the tension in his partner's body, his muscles taut, every nerve stretched tight. He was no longer the composed officer Harris had known. There was a palpable shift in him, something raw, something human, that had surfaced in the face of a threat neither of them could understand. "Keep driving," Daniels finally said, his voice low, almost strained. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and the car surged forward, picking up speed. But the footsteps, no, the feeling was still there. They were being hunted, stalked. And the weight of it was unbearable. The streets blurred past them, a mix of shadows and light, but no matter how fast they drove, Harris could still feel the eyes on them. He could feel the presence creeping up, like the slow advance of a storm before it broke, heavy and inevitable. Then, without warning, the car came to a screeching halt. The sound of tires grinding against the pavement echoed in the stillness of the night, and Harris's body lurched forward, his seatbelt tightening painfully across his chest. His heart raced as the adrenaline surged through his veins. "What the hell, Daniels?" Harris gasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But Daniels wasn't looking at him. His eyes were fixed ahead, his face ghostly pale. His lips trembled, but no words came out. Harris followed his gaze. At the end of the street stood a figure.
A man.
Tall, with a commanding presence. He wore a dark coat that blended with the shadows, but Harris could see the glint of something metallic at his side. A weapon, perhaps. But it wasn't just the man's appearance that made Harris's blood run cold. It was the way he stood, perfectly still, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the first move. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands still clutching the wheel, knuckles white. Harris swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had never seen anyone like this before. This wasn't just a suspect or a criminal. This was something else. Something dangerous. The man took a slow step forward, and Harris could feel his breath catch in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to drive, to get out of there, but his body wouldn't obey. His gaze was locked on the figure in the street, unable to look away. Without a word, the man raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. Harris froze. Daniels didn't move either. It was as if they were trapped in some kind of trance, unable to break free. "You should have stayed away." The man's voice came, low and steady, carrying an unspoken warning that sent a chill down Harris's spine. Daniels finally found his voice, but it was shaky, edged with panic. Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Does it matter?" Before either officer could react, the figure turned on his heel and vanished into the darkness. He was gone as quickly as he had come. The car was still frozen, the engine humming idly, but the silence was deafening. Harris's mind was racing, and his heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that he couldn't think straight. He couldn't breathe. "Go," Daniels whispered urgently, his voice barely audible, the fear in it palpable. Harris didn't need another command. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, and the car lurched forward, speeding down the street. But the feeling, the presence, didn't disappear. It was there, in the air, behind them, watching them, waiting for them to make their next mistake. And they both knew, deep down, that they were far from done. This was only the beginning. The car sped through the streets, its headlights slicing through the dark, but the oppressive silence inside the vehicle only seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Harris's hands gripped the seat, knuckles white, as he tried to steady his breathing. The sharp scent of sweat filled the car, mingling with the lingering smell of fear. Daniels's hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw set in a grim line, eyes darting back and forth between the rearview mirror and the road. His breathing was shallow, ragged, like he was holding on to something fragile that might shatter at any moment. They were both trapped, suffocated by the weight of what they had just encountered. Harris's heart still hammered in his chest. He could feel the echo of the man's chilling gaze, the sense that they were being followed, hunted. That presence, unseen yet unmistakable, was still there, hanging in the air like a toxic fog. They couldn't outrun it. "Daniels, we need to talk," Harris said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Daniels didn't respond. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his mind was somewhere else, far away. Harris could feel the tension in the car, like the string of a bow pulled too tight, waiting for the release. Daniels, Harris pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. What the hell was that back there?
Who was that guy?
For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the engine, the hum of the tires against the pavement. Finally, Daniels spoke, his voice low and strained. I don't know, he muttered, his voice trembling. But we're in deep now. Way too deep. Harris swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, constricted. He wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but he was afraid. Afraid of the truth that he could already feel in his bones. The truth that they had crossed a line they shouldn't have. That they had made an enemy of something far beyond their understanding. You saw his eyes, right? Harris asked, his voice trembling. He wasn't just some thug. He was different. Like he knew we were coming. Daniels nodded slowly, his expression distant. I felt it too. The way he moved. The way he didn't even flinch when we got close. It was like he was waiting for us, watching us. The streetlights blurred outside, their dim glow like distant stars in a sky that felt far too close. Harris could feel the fear gnawing at his insides, the realization sinking in that whatever they had stumbled into wasn't just some routine traffic stop. It wasn't just a mistake made in the heat of arrogance. It was something much darker. Something that had been watching them long before they even knew it. A shiver ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the thought of the man, the calm, collected manner in which he had confronted them. It was like he had known everything about them. Every move they would make, every word they would speak. It was a terrifying thought, one that made Harris's heart skip a beat. What if he's part of something bigger? Harris asked, barely able to voice the thought that had been growing in his mind. What if we've made enemies of, I don't know, someone powerful? Someone who can make us disappear? Daniels's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles going pale. I don't know, Harris. But I'm not sticking around to find out. The air in the car thickened, each breath feeling heavier than the last. They were in this together now, trapped in a world they had never signed up for. They were pawns in a game they didn't understand, and every turn they took, every decision they made, only seemed to sink them deeper into the shadows. We need to get out of here, Daniels said, his voice tight with panic. We need to leave the city. Now. Harris's mind raced, his thoughts spinning in a whirlpool of confusion and fear. But he knew Daniels was right. They had to get away. But from what? The man? The shadowy figure? Or something even worse than they had imagined. The car shot down the street, the tires screeching against the pavement as Daniels pushed the accelerator harder. The city was a blur around them, the buildings and streets melting into a mix of colors and shadows. But even as they sped away, Harris could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. They couldn't outrun this. Not for long. We need a plan, Harris said, his voice strained with the effort of keeping his thoughts clear. We need to figure out who we're dealing with. Who he is, what he wants. Daniels's face was hard, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was scared, too, scared in a way Harris had never seen before. The tough, confident officer who always had a plan seemed like a shadow of himself now, lost and uncertain in the face of something he couldn't control. Plan. Daniels's voice was bitter, almost a laugh. We don't even know who we're dealing with, Harris. We're in over our heads. Harris turned to look at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. What are you saying? We just let this go? We just run? What if? Before he could finish his sentence, a sudden crash interrupted him. The car lurched forward, its tires squealing as it swerved violently to the left. Harris's heart leaped into his throat as the vehicle veered off course, crashing into the sidewalk and narrowly missing a streetlight. Daniels! Harris shouted, panic rising in his chest. What the hell is going on? Daniels's hands were no longer on the wheel. He had frozen. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes wide with horror as he stared out the windshield. Harris whipped his head toward the front of the car, his stomach dropping when he saw what Daniels had seen. A figure stood in the middle of the street. The same man. The same shadowy figure. He was standing directly in their path, not even flinching as the car barreled toward him. His face was unreadable, his body completely still. Harris's breath caught in his throat, his pulse racing. Daniels, stop. Stop the car. But Daniels was frozen, his hands trembling as he tried to regain control, his mind struggling to process the impossible. The figure didn't move. He didn't flinch. It was as if he had known this moment would come, as if he had been waiting for it. The car continued to speed toward him, unstoppable, like a freight train on a collision course with destiny. Get out of the way, Harris screamed, his voice hoarse with desperation. But the figure didn't budge. In one final, horrifying moment, the car collided with the man. The impact was deafening. Harris's world tilted sideways as the car spun out of control, the screeching tires tearing at the road. Everything went dark. The world went silent. For a brief, unbearable moment, Harris couldn't hear anything. No tires screeching, no metal twisting, no engine roaring. Just an overwhelming silence that pressed in on him from all sides, as if time itself had stopped. And then, as if in slow motion, the car spun out of control. Harris could feel his body being thrown from side to side as the vehicle veered off the road, the headlights flickering erratically like they were struggling to stay alive. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a heavy thud in the otherwise empty space. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps, his lungs fighting to take in air as his mind scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. The impact, how could it have been so real, so violent? They had hit the man. They had hit him with everything they had, and yet, where was he? The car jerked to a sudden halt, throwing Harris back into his seat. The world outside the shattered windows was a blur of lights and darkness. Harris could feel the weight of the silence now, pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. Daniels, he gasped, his voice strained, almost raw. Daniels, are you okay? There was no answer. Harris's heart raced. His eyes frantically searched the seat beside him, but Daniels wasn't there. The officer was gone. Daniels! Harris shouted, his voice rising in panic. He threw open the door, his hands trembling as they grasped the cold metal. He stumbled out into the night, his legs shaky beneath him as he tried to steady himself. The world seemed to tilt around him, a distorted blur of streetlights and shadows. And then he saw him. The man, he was standing there, right in front of him. His heart skipped a beat, and a cold wave of terror swept through his body. The figure was unharmed, untouched. Not a single scratch. He was standing tall, as if the impact hadn't even happened. His expression was unreadable, cold, almost distant. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Harris's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. He had just crashed into him at full speed. The force should have been enough to. Why? Harris croaked, his voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. Why are you doing this? The man didn't speak at first. He just looked at Harris, his eyes piercing and dark. His face was expressionless, almost like a statue, stoic and unwavering in the face of the chaos he had just caused. Harris took a hesitant step forward, but the man remained still. There was no fear in him, no hesitation. He stood there as though he had all the time in the world, like he was waiting for something. You don't belong here, the man's voice was low, calm. It seemed to echo in Harris's mind, reverberating through his chest like a warning. You've crossed a line. A chill ran down Harris's spine. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had heard this before. From Daniels. From his own thoughts. The feeling that they had crossed something. Something they should have never touched. You're one of them, aren't you? Harris whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the realization. He had known it all along, hadn't he? That this wasn't just some random street encounter. That this man, this figure, was part of something much larger. Something dangerous. Something he couldn't even comprehend. The man didn't answer. He simply stepped closer, his presence looming like a dark cloud hanging overhead, suffocating the very air around them. And then, without warning, Daniels appeared, emerging from the shadows, staggering toward Harris. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. His hands were shaking. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Harris," Daniels gasped, his voice ragged. "We need to leave.
Now."
But before Harris could respond, the figure in front of them shifted. His eyes, dark, cold, focused on Daniels. Harris felt a sudden wave of panic grip his chest. Daniels froze. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The world held its breath. "I warned you." The man's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried with it a weight that felt like 1,000 pounds. "You didn't listen." Daniels tried to move, to step back, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs were stiff, locked in place by some unseen force. Harris's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for his partner, but before he could even touch him, the man moved again. Faster than Harris could follow. It was like a blur. One moment the man was standing there, and the next he was right in front of Daniels. He grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground effortlessly, as if he were nothing more than a child. Daniels's eyes widened in terror, his hands clutching at the man's grip, gasping for air. Harris could see the fear in his partner's eyes, the same fear that gripped him now. "Stop," Harris screamed, his voice breaking. "Let him go." The man didn't respond. He just stared into Harris's eyes, his gaze cold and unfeeling. It was as if he was savoring the moment, enjoying the fear that radiated from them both. "Why are you doing this?" Harris demanded, his voice hoarse with panic and confusion. "What do you want from us?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was something darker. A smile that spoke of power. Of control. "I've already told you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've crossed a line." The world around Harris seemed to blur as his mind raced, desperate for an answer. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. His hands were trembling as he stepped forward, but the fear held him back. And then it hit him, the truth. The one thing he hadn't wanted to admit. They weren't just dealing with a man. They weren't dealing with someone they could reason with, someone they could fight. They were in the presence of something far more powerful than they could ever understand. Something ancient, something that didn't need to explain itself. Something that had been watching them, waiting for them. And now, they had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. "Let him go," Harris shouted again, his voice desperate, but the man didn't budge. His grip on Daniels's throat tightened, and Harris could see his partner's face turning red, his eyes bulging in fear. This was it. They had pushed too far, and now they were going to pay the price. And in that moment, Harris realized there was nothing they could do to change it. There was no escape. They had crossed a line, and now they were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The man's grip tightened once more, and Daniels gasped, his hands falling limp at his sides. Harris's heart screamed in his chest, his legs moving on their own, but his body felt like lead. He was paralyzed with fear. The world around him seemed to shrink, the air growing heavier, suffocating him with the weight of his own helplessness. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the man released Daniels, letting him fall to the ground in a heap. Daniels gasped for air, his body racked with violent coughs. Harris rushed to his side, his hands shaking as he helped his partner up, but neither of them could look away from the figure standing in front of them. The man simply turned and walked away, his steps deliberate, his figure fading into the darkness like a ghost. Harris watched him disappear, feeling the weight of his presence still pressing on his chest, even as he was gone. It was over. The nightmare had only just begun. Harris helped Daniels to his feet, his hands still trembling from the shock of what had just happened. The cold air felt suffocating, heavier than ever, pressing in on them from all sides. His heart was racing, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, terror, and disbelief. Daniels's cough slowly subsided, but his body was still shuddering, his breaths uneven, like he couldn't catch his air. He looked at Harris, his eyes wide, filled with a mix of fear and something deeper, guilt. Maybe? Regret? Harris couldn't be sure. "You okay?" Harris whispered, his voice thick, fighting against the tremor that ran through him. He wasn't sure who he was asking. Daniels? Or himself? Daniels nodded weakly, but didn't say anything. His eyes kept scanning the street, darting back and forth like he was afraid of being watched. Harris followed his gaze, but there was nothing. Only the silence, the dark emptiness of the street that now felt more like a trap than a place of refuge. "We can't let him get away," Harris said, his voice firmer now, his resolve growing. "We need to find him. We need to." "No," Danielle's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but there was a finality to it that stopped Harris in his tracks. Harris turned to him, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean, no? We can't just let him walk away, Daniels. He's not human. What he did to you, what he almost did to you." "I know," Daniels interrupted, his voice breaking. "But that man," he trailed off, his gaze locked on the empty street. His body was trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Something Harris couldn't understand. "That man is not what we think he is. We're not going to find him. Not like this." Harris stared at him, his mind struggling to process Danielle's words. "What are you talking about? You saw what he did to you. He was supernatural, Daniels. He didn't even flinch when we hit him with the car. He didn't even." Daniels cut him off, his voice desperate. "You don't understand, Harris. I'm telling you, we're in way over our heads. This is bigger than us. Bigger than anything we could ever handle." Harris's chest tightened. He felt something gnawing at him, a sickening sense of helplessness that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Then what the hell do we do, huh? Just walk away? Let him win?" Danielle's eyes were filled with pain, his voice barely a whisper as he answered. "We survive. We get out of here before it's too late." The words hit Harris like a slap to the face. "Survive," he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "You think we can just walk away from this? After everything we've seen? After everything I've seen what's coming, Harris," Daniels interrupted, his eyes dark with something Harris couldn't place. "And I'm telling you, if we don't leave now, we're not going to make it out alive. We won't make it through the night." The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence around them more oppressive. Harris could feel the cold creeping into his bones, but it wasn't just the chill of the night that made him shiver. It was the fear. The raw, unfiltered fear that Daniels was giving voice to. Fear of something so much bigger than them. The man, that figure in the street, Harris had thought he was just another criminal, another thug to take down. But now, everything had changed. They hadn't just run into the wrong person. They had run into something else entirely. Something that made every crime, every rule, every badge they had ever worn seem irrelevant. "I don't know what to do," Harris whispered, more to himself than to Daniels. The truth was, he had never felt so small, so powerless. This wasn't the world he knew. He had always believed in the system, in the law. But now, the system felt like a joke. A mere illusion. Daniels didn't answer at first. He just stared ahead, his face pale, his eyes empty. Then finally he spoke, his voice filled with regret. "I should have known better. We shouldn't have gotten involved. This isn't our fight. We never stood a chance." Harris felt the sting of his words deep in his chest. The guilt, the helplessness, it all threatened to consume him. He had never been one to back down. He had always fought, always believed that there was a way to fix things. But this was different. This wasn't a case. This wasn't a criminal to catch. This wasn't something he could fight his way out of. He looked around the street, his gaze shifting to the shadows that seemed to close in around them. The buildings, the empty cars parked along the road. All of it felt wrong. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Where do we go?" Harris asked, his voice small now. "Where do we run to?" Daniels didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed ahead, but his eyes were distant, lost in thought. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "There's no running, Harris. Not from him. Not from them." Harris swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing heavier. "What are you saying?" Danielle's eyes met his, and for the first time, Harris saw something like fear in his partner's eyes. Something deep and raw. I'm saying we've crossed a line. And now, there's no going back. The words hit Harris like a punch to the gut. He felt his knees weaken, the weight of them pressing down on him. He had heard the warnings, the unspoken threats, but now it was all too real. There was no escape. No way out. The world they had known was slipping away, piece by piece, and in its place was something darker. Something monstrous. I never thought, Harris began, but his voice faltered. I never thought we'd end up here. I never thought I'd be running from something like this. Danielle's face was lined with exhaustion. His body slumped as if the weight of the world was too much to bear. He looked at Harris, his eyes searching, pleading. I know. I never thought we'd be here either. But it's too late now. They'll come for us. We can't outrun them. Harris stood there, his heart heavy with the weight of Danielle's words. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. What had they gotten themselves into? What had they awakened?
And why?
Why had this happened to them? What had they done to deserve this? The shadows seemed to stretch farther now, pressing in around them like a blanket. The night felt colder, darker, as if it were closing in. And then, as Harris stood there, his mind spinning with questions he didn't have answers to, he heard it. A sound, faint at first, like a whisper in the wind. But then it grew louder. Closer. Footsteps. Heavy.
Steady.
Unyielding. Harris's breath caught in his throat as the sound grew, echoing in the silence. He turned, his heart pounding, his mind screaming at him to run.
But there was nowhere to run to.
Not anymore. They were coming. And this time Harris knew. He knew they wouldn't escape. As the footsteps grew louder, the weight of the moment settled around Harris and Daniels like an iron vice. They stood frozen, the night air thick with fear, and the sense that something far beyond their control was unfolding before their eyes. The shadows of the street seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if the darkness itself was coming alive to consume them. Harris turned to Daniels, his eyes wide with desperation. What do we do now? We can't just stand here.
We need to fight back.
We need to do something. But Daniels, though still standing beside him, had a look in his eyes that Harris had never seen before. It wasn't fear, not exactly, it was something deeper. A resigned calm, like he knew the inevitable had already arrived. His shoulders were slumped, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of something much heavier. They're here, Harris, Daniels whispered, his voice hoarse. And there's nothing we can do. This was never our fight, but we made it ours anyway. The sound of approaching footsteps was now undeniable, steady and deliberate. Each step was like a hammer strike against Harris's heart. There was no escaping it. No running. No more choices. Suddenly, a shadow emerged from the alley, tall and looming, like the embodiment of everything they feared. The figure stepped into the dim light, his dark eyes glinting with an unsettling calm. The same man. The one who had nearly crushed Daniels in that cold, heartless grip. Harris took a step back, his pulse quickening. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why us? What did we do? The man didn't answer at first. His gaze, cold and unwavering, swept over the two officers. And then, almost as if he were savoring the moment, he spoke. You didn't do anything. You never had a choice. The words hit Harris like a slap. The weight of them settled over him, suffocating him with the truth he had denied, the truth that Daniels had known all along. This wasn't about right or wrong, or even about the law. This was something bigger. This was destiny. A destiny that had pulled them into its grasp without mercy. Harris felt his knees weaken, his mind spinning with the realization. They had been pawns in a game they didn't understand, and now they were about to lose. Why us? Daniels asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Because you were meant to find out. You were meant to see what lies beneath the surface. The world you know, the one you live in, it's only a small part of something much darker. Something much bigger. And now, you're part of that story. The wind picked up, a gust of cold air rushing through the street, carrying with it the scent of something distant and forgotten. Harris stood there, his heart pounding, but there was no fear left. Only sorrow. A deep, aching sorrow for everything they had lost and everything they would never have again. "You've seen too much," the man said, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "But that's the way it goes. People like you, people like us, we don't get to choose how the story ends." Harris's breath caught in his throat. What happens now?
Now.
The man stepped closer, his figure casting a long shadow over Harris and Daniels. "Now you make your peace. You'll remember this moment. And you'll remember that sometimes the truth is more dangerous than any lie." There was a heavy pause, the weight of the moment hanging between them like a veil. And then, without another word, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. His footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Harris and Daniels standing there alone. The wind died down, and the street was still again, but the silence was deafening. Harris looked at Daniels, his chest heavy with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. His mind was racing with questions, with doubts, with the overwhelming realization that nothing would ever be the same again. Daniels, too, stood there, his face pale, his eyes empty. He wasn't looking at Harris anymore. He was looking into the darkness where the man had disappeared. "What now?" Harris asked quietly. Daniels didn't answer at first. He simply stood there, staring into the void, as if searching for an answer in the empty night. And then, finally, he turned to Harris, his eyes filled with something that seemed like peace. A quiet acceptance. "Now," Daniels said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion, "we move on. We have to. Because if we don't, we'll be stuck in this moment forever. And we can't let that happen. We can't let the darkness win." Harris nodded slowly, the weight of Danielle's words settling over him like a final truth. They had lost, but they had also learned. They had seen beyond the veil. And though the world they once knew was shattered, they still had a choice. A choice to move forward, no matter how broken they were. As the two officers turned and walked down the street, the sound of their footsteps was the only noise left, echoing in the stillness of the night. And as they disappeared into the darkness, a new chapter began. One that would be remembered, not for the fight they had lost, but for the lessons they had learned. If you've enjoyed this gripping story and want to see more heart-pounding, emotional journeys unfold, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't miss out on the next chapter of our saga. Join us as we dive deeper into the world of the unknown. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more unforgettable stories. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle for their very souls.